So we will start with the thing that happens at first, before the interview. So before you start the interview, you have to do a few things. And this is also relevant when you write your method, because then you need to show that you kind of plan for it, that you planned your interviews, that you didn't just went into the world asking questions to random people. So the first part, identifying the interviewer, it is useful when you are planning, but it is mandatory to write in your thesis. You have to talk about these aspects of how did you identify the people that you will interview. So for instance, and this helps for you also if you're deciding on interviewing or not, does that person has knowledge about the topic? Because maybe you want to interview the secretary, for example, but maybe secretary doesn't have knowledge about like top management decisions, for example. So then maybe it's not the right person in terms of the topic. And you need to write this in the thesis. I think the other, knowing if the person is relevant or not, it's a bit obvious sometimes, and you know it, but you have to write it. And I think this gives you a good guide on how to write it. So highlight if the person has knowledge about the topic. Another thing is highlight that the perspective of that person is relevant. Like maybe he is a relevant stakeholder that maybe is a client, for example. So if you have access to interview the client, that's a great perspective. And in similar way, also highlight it that by including that person, you are including a different perspective, giving more power to your qualitative work through triangulation. So talk about this. Why is this person important? You can reflect on that before, but if it was obvious for you, then at least write it in your thesis. Don't think that the reader will think it's obvious. And then this is kind of the same thing. In practice, how do you sample your interviewers, the respondent, is much more practical oriented. It's basically like if the person is able to do it, you will do it, and then you will ask people to do the interview, to answer to the interview, and if they are okay, then you go for it, and then you later manage on how to justify, right? But the sampling strategy is also important to write in your thesis. Like that random approach of sending it to everyone is not the best idea, so you have to justify in your thesis how you do it. And these are a few ideas that you can use to justify that. So for example, volunteering, like you ask people in the firm that you're studying to volunteer on the interview. You can say that that was one of the approaches, and from that approach you had 5 respondents, for example. Then the snowball is based on people who already say yes, then you ask, could you tell me someone else who can be interviewed, and maybe can you help me to introduce the topic a little bit? So that's another approach that you can say. And then we have 2 other that are very into filtering rather than more exploring for new respondents, which is based on the purpose of the person. Like you think very practical, is this person useful for the research, for the research or not? And also theoretical, like maybe for you it is about top managers, and then you will only interview top managers. So it's more like on filtering. But although in practice maybe it will be obvious again, and it will be very practically oriented, when you write, you have to show that you had any type of strategy. So these are suggestions on what to write when you write that in your thesis. Then before the interview, we're still in there, you need to prepare an interview guide. This is a must in structured and semi-structured. In unstructured interview is not that necessarily, but it is still useful. So when you prepare your interview guide, think about general questions that you don't want to miss. But I think to explaining the interview guide, I will focus on the semi-structured interview. When you have a guide, but that you are open to discuss topics that come during the interview, that come up during the interview. So when you write your interview guide, think about general questions that you don't want to miss or that are very important, but you are always open. Then reflect if these questions are related to a research question. Also, when you write your method, you have to show this, like you have to say, I did an interview guide, and the interview guide, you will probably add it in an appendix, and you say each question was informed, hopefully by the literature, hopefully by the literature review that you did. It was based on these aspects and concepts that were relevant from the literature review. You can also highlight some other research that use similar questions differently, and this is a big difference to quant, where the survey has to be tested before, so that's why you always use an already tested survey from other research. In here, it doesn't have to be like that. You can plan your own question as long as you justify that it makes sense. Like if you want to test for the cultural difference, you can bring your own question, but you just have to show that it is related to the things that are discussed in the literature. So it is not that is as strict as in quant. In quant, you had to reuse something that has been used before because it is very difficult to test a survey. But here, no, here is not like that. And then when you prepare the interview guide, also plan your interview, like think about how much time it will take and all of this, what comes first, what comes second and last. And finally, it is useful if you also design an introduction. Sometimes people like that, like the respondents like to have a quick introduction about your research. So probably even before contacting, you will have to do this. It is also nice sometimes, but you have to reflect on that if it is a good idea to send a mini summary of what you will talk about. So sometimes they can prepare, but it depends. Sometimes it's good. And remember, all of this, you have to write it. So if you did it, you have to write it in your thesis and justify. So if you send a mini summary before, you can claim that it's because they ask for it, and then you try to be not that, if that is the case, that you didn't want to reveal everything because you wanted to get surprised if that is relevant for your research. So explain everything. And so I think that mostly covers what to do before the interview. I think the next video we will talk about how to actually do the interview and what comes after.